This is a complete care guide for growing Phalaenopsis, and this would apply for mini phals or large size Phalaenopsis. But I'm not sure if all of my notes here would apply to species like the Balena, which blooms in the summertime. I've never grown those species before. This care guide is mostly for hybrids that you find in the grocery store. In addition, this would be at a beginner's or intermediate levels. No advanced things, stuff like induced reproductions with hormones. So some reasons why Phalaenopsis are great to grow. One is they're easy to grow compared to all the other orchids. They grow very fast. The blooms are very long lasting. They are very replaceable, honestly. They're cheap. And lastly, they're fairly compact. The only setback I have with growing Phalaenopsis is that I have to grow it indoors. I cannot grow it outdoors. I have too many issues with crown rot when it rains. So the next thing I want to talk about is watering, because after you purchase a Phalaenopsis, you probably are wondering how often you should water. So I think it's pretty safe to say that you should feel the media, and if it feels dry, you should water. And that may be once a week or twice a week. I'm not sure how dry your environment is, but for me, I go towards about every 3 to 4 days because I have very well-drained media. I would like to water more frequently. When you water, do avoid getting the leaves and especially the crown wet. If you do happen to get it wet, I would just use a little paper towel or a Q-tip to dry those center spots. Next, let's talk about fertilizing to keep those blooms in good health and long lasting. While it's in bloom, ideally you should give it a low dose fertilizer at every watering. Give it a slightly boost in the middle number, which is the phosphorus from the NPK. And you can find any bloom booster fertilizer in Lowe's or Home Depot, or even in Walmart. I use the cheap Better Grow one. So when the orchid is not in bloom and it's in its growth phase, I use this Jack's Classic Orchid Special 30-10-10, and I think it's similar or is the same as the Peters Excel. I also add a dash of the CalMag, and ideally it's best to fertilize every week, a very low dose amount. When you see the blooms are starting to go as far as dying off, back off on the feeding and give the plant a break and just do clear water for a couple of weeks. So let's talk about how to cut the bloom spike off when the flowers are dropped off and the bloom spikes are starting to deteriorate. So the bloom should last a long time, about 2 to 3 months if it's properly cared for. After the blooms drop, you can cut the spike to encourage branching. Cut at second or third node above the base. Sometimes the old spike will naturally dry down to where you should naturally cut off. And you can see that in this picture that I'm showing you. So let's talk about repotting now that the blooms are done, because that's the best time to repot. But if you have to repot while the orchid's in bloom, it's okay to do that, just as long as you handle the roots with care. I have a habit of repotting my orchids right away. When I get them, I just can't help it. I want to look and see what the roots are like, and at the same time, I'm asked for repot. So let's talk about the size of pots to choose. We prefer small, tall pots with lots of drainage. Clear cups for see-through would be great, or net pots for aeration or drainage, if you like, mounting is great too if you have the time to water often. So I choose a net pot, and I choose to pot in clay pebbles And I have a little cup for the net pot to sit in. And then what I do is I add a little water in that cup to let the clay pebbles soak up some of that water. And in turn, the roots soak up that water as well. Remove all the moss and all the sponge material from the pot and the roots, and then wash it off and dry up the leaves as needed so that the crown doesn't get wet. And then you can repot it in any media you like. Lots of people put it in wood chips or barks, or even moss again. Whatever's best for you. Just remember that whatever media you use, water accordingly. So if you put it in moss, make sure you don't water too often, because that moss will tend to keep moisture for a longer period of time than clay pebbles. So I water very frequently. If you're interested in making your own pots, I have a couple of videos that shows you how to burn holes using a solder, or even if you want to drill holes with a drill bit, you can do that also in a plastic cup. So I'd mentioned before, I pot most of my orchids in clay pebble because I don't want to repot every few years. And I also like these clay pebbles because I feel that there's less disease and less insects that could live in these clay pebbles. And it also allows me to flush very thoroughly, less impurities and less things get trapped in these clay pebbles. So that's why I choose them. But I'm going back and forth with adding more moss into these clay pebble mix. And to water plants that are potted in clay pebbles, you have to soak the pot in a container for sometimes 30-40 minutes every week to help it catch up in water intake, because watering freely without soaking generally will not be enough. Okay, let's talk about the most important thing next. It's reblooming the Phalaenopsis. So in the key to reblooming is give it some time in cold period, like about 50 to 55 degree Fahrenheit. I have not had any foul damage at about 50 degree Fahrenheit, so I think that's fairly safe. So during a time about December when it's starting to get cold, I bring it out towards my sunroom, which has a covered area where it doesn't get rained on. And but if you have a covered porch, that will work too, to keep it outside as long as the temperature doesn't drop too low. If you feel that certain nights are too low, like in the 40s, just be careful. 48 would probably be okay. Just don't let it go below 45, I think, so that the orchid doesn't suffer. So I would recommend giving it that cold cycle of 50 degree Fahrenheit for about 10 days, and that should do the trick to induce the bloom spike. And make sure again you put it in a covered porch area where it doesn't get direct sun or any rain, because you don't want any wetness. You want controlled watering. You don't want any water on top of the leaves just in case, so it doesn't rot, because it tends to rot when it's cold and it gets damp. So I'm showing you all these bloom spikes that have been induced, and what I'm doing is putting it by the kitchen window now that it's all in spike from the sunroom. And I put it back in a warm weather so that it doesn't have to be stressed anymore now that the spikes are showing up. I forgot to mention earlier too that if the leaves are limp on the Phalaenopsis, then that is an indication that the orchid is dehydrated and it needs to be soaked. But it also could indicate that the roots on the orchid are rotten and needs to be repotted, and then add moist moss again to encourage rerooting. The next thing I want to talk about is caring for keikis and dividing off the keikis. I have had this keiki on this orchid for a while now, long enough that it is producing a bloom spike. Here is the keiki. This, believe it or not, on top of the main orchid is this portion. And then you see the keiki right there with the roots. And it's definitely long enough, but I don't want to pull it off yet because the bloom spike. So we want to wait till after the bloom spike is spent. Then we will pull this keiki off. What I would do is I would hold on to this main portion and hold on to the the keiki center, and then just snap it off or twist it back and forth until it comes off. And mostly you want to wait until the roots are long enough, which it is. It's got two really thick roots right here. And actually, I think I found another keiki on this orchid, and as you can see, it's orchid's a little bit sick. So there is another keiki right here. That's the second keiki developing. So yeah, I think it had spider mite at one point. I had cleaned everything off, and it looks like there's some remnants damage it shows. But they are prone to spider mites. So I normally have these orchids sitting in my kitchen window, which faces western light on one side and northern light on another side. It's a corner window. It's more ideal if you could just offer it northern light if you can, but if you can't, provide shade then with a cloth curtain. Well, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.